It's really an honor to be able to speak to you both, especially ahead of Celebration. I'd love for you to just kind of start with telling me about your roles in Droids, Ewoks, and the holiday special, and kind of how did you end up working on these projects?
We started a company called Nelvana, and had just done our first fully animated special called A Cosmic Christmas, and it was syndicated throughout the United States and the world. And we were working on our second fully animated special called The Devil and Daniel Mouse. We got a call out of the blue from Lucasfilm saying that they were looking for a company to do a 10-minute cartoon for the Star Wars holiday special that they were doing for CBS. And would we be interested in producing it? And they basically explained that, George had seen A Cosmic Christmas, really liked it, and wanted to use the company that did that, even though 20th Century Fox, his partners at the time, and the CBS network all wanted to go with Hanna-Barbera, who were doing like 90% of the animation in America. But, Lucas was always sort of a maverick, right? He worked out of San Francisco rather than LA, and he liked companies that weren't in LA. He just had a preference. And he liked independent filmmakers, and we fit the bill. So I flew down to Marin County, met with George, and we landed the show. One of the things that got us on the same page very quickly was the design thinking that Clive and his design partner, Frank Nissen, had identified.
I mean, the challenge of turning Star Wars into an animated film and finding the animated version of it was quite extraordinary. And it was really a wonderful opportunity because Star Wars, I mean, we'd only ever seen the first movie, the first film. And I mean, it blew me away completely. And one of the amazing things about Star Wars was how different it was to other science fiction films that precluded it because there was a reality that George created. It was real. It was real. Things were dirty. Things were beaten up. Things were lived in. And even though it was a certain level of fantasy, even the fantasy was believable. And that was something that we needed to carry on with the cartoon. We didn't want to make it into a happy cartoony cartoon. So one of the graphic styles that I was very, very keen on and had followed was Mobius, who was a French cartoonist, a comic book artist. And I'd been looking into his stuff in heavy metal for years and really, really loved it. And the one thing about his work was that it was believable. It was the same kind of thing. It was very futuristic. It was very fantastical in many ways, but in many ways it was totally grounded. So that's what we chose to move forward with the design of the Star Wars cartoon. And in terms of the production, they had built a costume based on the designs of Joe Johnson and who was it? Who's the other amazing artist that did a lot of the design work? But they had created a costume and just a mock-up, really, and sent us a film. It was on 16 millimeter black and white film of a guy walking around a garden in LA somewhere with this costume on. So we used that movie footage in order to design and finalize the design of Boba Fett. And it worked really well. I mean, it's people loved it. So that's how we worked forward with it.
Yeah, so when I shared Clive's vision for the design and the look and feel of the film, George was very excited. That was what he wanted. He didn't want a Saturday morning look. It was a primetime special, and he was looking to do his own thing. The designer that you were looking for, Clive, was Ralph McQuarrie.
Yeah, that's right, Ralph. Yeah.
I think the Boba Fett design did come from Joe Johnson, but
Well, Ralph did some early roughs, I think, and then Joe did the final design. Yeah.
and Joe had written the script for The Faithful Wookiee, which was the 10-minute short that we ended up doing, though it was based on a story from George. So when I met with George on that first occasion, at the conclusion of the meeting, when it was pretty clear, we got along, he liked what our company was doing and what our studio was doing and wanted to work with us. And he said, and you'll get to introduce Boba Fett. And I said, Boba what? Because nobody knew who Boba Fett was at the time. But for George, that was a big deal. And obviously, as time has panned out, it turned out to be a big deal. But at the moment, it was kind of like, oh, that's great. We'll introduce Boba Fett, whatever that means. Right?
I love that because it's like, yeah, this is just some guy that you've never heard of, and then yeah, definitely we're ready to, bring Boba Fett to life.
And the thing about Boba Fett in the film that we did was that Boba Fett was really an unknown character, completely unknown. And he hadn't been developed to the way he is now. I mean, he has all sorts of background and layers and stuff. So he was just an unknown character. And it was very much based on the Western movies, that kind of quality, you know. We really didn't know much about him either. So we were just working with the limited amount of story work in the script and just used that and made the most of what we had to make him act in the piece, you know.
One of the things that was, a big challenge as well in doing the 10-minute short was the fact that there wasn't much time. By the time they'd come around to focusing on the 10-minute cartoon, we had a few months to do it. So we did everything expeditiously, but meanwhile, we were busy working on Devil Daniel Mouse. So we were sort of, for the first time, doing two projects at once, which was not what we were used to at the time. Later, we became used to that, but back then, that was a novelty. It was an incredible experience for us because we got to work with a lot of George's people, not only Joe Johnson, but Ben Burt, who was a great sound designer. And everybody on, the Lucasfilm team was sort of top in their field. And it helped our studio, which was a young studio, as we were growing and developing, because we were in Toronto and we didn't have access to the same depth of talent in all these departments that Lucasfilm did. So we benefited from that experience. And at the same time, we also benefited because we developed a relationship with George Lucas, who mentored our studio and helped us as we went on to do our first animated feature, Rock and Rule, and he gave us advice along the way, and that was invaluable to us.
Yeah, it sounds like you had this very close relationship with George Lucas. I mean, what was that like? Obviously, he'd been in the biz for a little bit and he just put out this like Star Wars movie that everyone was talking about. What did that feel like being the people who were chosen to continue on this vision that he had originated?
I really enjoyed the little connection that I had personally with George, just sort of maybe 4 or 5 meetings on different things. But he was so down to earth. He didn't behave like a super executive producer. He didn't even feel like he was in the same business as Hollywood. He was outside of that world. And he was just so genuine. And he was incredibly perceptive, incredibly thoughtful, and just treated us on the same level. So the meetings that I had with him were all very creative meetings and very work kind of meetings.
Yeah, and that was our relationship, right? Not only producing the Faithful Wookiee, but also going on to do the first animated series for Saturday morning, Ewoks and Droids. So the relationship with George continued for many years. And it's one of the things that I think we really treasure was that he was terrific to work with, was very helpful to us, and it was an important relationship for us to build on. One of the things that sticks with me in terms of what Clive was saying is that in terms of how down to earth George was, he was showing me Skywalker Ranch and what he was going to do there. We were on a meeting and he said, "We'll jump in the car and we'll go see the ranch." Of course, I said, "What is a ranch? What's the ranch?" Well, he said, "You'll see." He shared with me that his dream, his passion as a young filmmaker would have been to go to work for the National Film Board of Canada. And that was one of, the things that connected him to us was he loved the National Film Board. He loved the experimental shorts they did. He loved the animation they did. He said that would have made him happier than anything to just be working at the National Film Board making shorts. And, you kind of get a sense that he's a guy who just had this explosive success, not only with Star Wars, but American Graffiti and, Raiders of the Lost Ark and his entire sort of business construct. That stands out for me as being a very unique part of his personality that he really wanted to make experimental film shorts.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a part of George Lucas's legacy is kind of that experimentation and like pushing film techniques and film just generally forward,
Well,
however
and digital.
possible.
Sure, and digital, because he developed
Yes.
not
Yep.
only THX, the sound thing, but also the Edit Droid, the first nonlinear editing tool for film,
Hmm.
and also Pixar.
Right. You
And
know,
when
just a little studio you may have heard of.
yeah, and when we were working on Droids and Ewoks, he told me that with Droids, he would really like to have animated it on CGI and have that Pixar team, but they were just at the very beginning. They were just learning how to animate on their software they were developing and doing the lamp, the Luxo lamp.
That's really cool. Super interesting. Kind of going a little bit back to our first question, you said that you had kind of a lot of leeway to create Boba Fett and create this world within that 10-minute special and use your own creativity. What was that like? Tell me about that process.
Well, we got the script from George, so he wrote that. So what we do to turn that into an animated sequence is obviously we first of all have to design the world. So we designed the Boba Fett and we had the other characters already. So we had to, of course, treat them the same way. So we had Leia and all the main characters. So we had to then draw them as 2D characters. So we designed those and we designed backgrounds. We designed what I just figured out what it was going to look like. And then we storyboard everything. So that's sort of like doing a comic book, but you're doing it so that it's going to work cinematically. That then we shoot on video. I guess it was on video. I was going to say
Oh
film.
no, 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 we shot it on film. That was a 35
But
millimeter, the Leica reel. Is that what you're talking
like a
about?
real, did we?
Yeah,
Yeah, I guess
yeah,
we
we
did.
did. And then we
Yeah,
turned it
that's
into
right.
a film strip because we
Right.
cut it up and make slides. We showed it as a film strip. I think we brought our own film strip projector because by that time film strip projectors were kind of like hard to find. And Clive went through it, performed the acting and the voices and described what was happening in the storyboard. And it was obviously a 10-minute short, 10-minute storyboard. The
It took
story
an hour to go through, by the way, to talk about it.
the storyboard was also up in the same room on paper, it was papered on the wall. And at the end of the performance of the storyboard, George had just a couple of things he wanted to change, and he was able to go to the wall and with Clive, point out the two or three things that he wanted to change. And that was it. The movie was locked and we were making it.
But the interesting thing is that those two or three things I had already flagged because there were a couple of things I wasn't quite sure if they were like one was a transition and another one was whether or not we needed a certain detail, which I knew wouldn't really be picked up. Anyway, George went straight to those things. Okay, here, this is the kind of transition you should do, which was a transition that I thought of and I hadn't really liked it, but anyway, it worked really well. And then the little details that I assume would not be seen, but George was very, very specific about everything. And he said, yes, put it in because it's at least it's there so that you go back over it and you can see that that detail was there. So
That's really cool. It's great that, you were kind of the same mind there with those little questions that you might have had.
it made me feel really good. Yes,
Yes, nice.
indeed.
Nice.
It's
One
great
thing,
feeling on the same page as somebody like George.
Right.
one thing I just want to point out is Clive and I have different memories as to who wrote the script. I'm
Oh,
going to Kathleen Kennedy and see if she can validate it, but maybe not. Clive thinks it was George. I'm pretty sure it was Joe Johnson who wrote the script and that George wrote the story. But
Okay.
okay.
George wrote the story for
we're
sure.
just two guys who worked on this 50 years ago and arguing about it as if like, it really is a huge difference. But anyway,
Well, it's
uh,
so it's so hard, after 50 years and you're just like, wait a minute. Are we remembering the story right? So,
It's a long time ago,
no,
really.
in the script we have that Clive has actually just says story by George Lucas.
Yeah.
oh, okay.
So I think that supports my theory. But anyway, let's leave that aside. So the success of the Faithful Wookiee, because even though the 2 hour special was something that Lucasfilm wasn't happy with, they weren't hands on the variety part of the special. You know, the studio had brought in Smith Hemian, who were the top Emmy Award winning variety producers, but I don't think they were necessarily right for this project, right? But as it turns out, George had kept the cartoon as his baby, and he managed and produced, that with us. And so that was the piece he was happy with, and I think the audience was generally happy with it. And it led to us doing Ewoks and Droids. 6 years later, we got the call from Lucasfilm saying, "Hey, you guys still, want to do some animation with us?" And we said, "Yeah." And the great news was they had sold it to ABC, and we were already doing shows with ABC, and ABC liked us. And we did Ewoks and Droids, and they were 2 very different shows. With Droids, one of the challenges was adapting the style that had been used for the Faithful Wookiee, the Mobius style, and taking a little bit of that style that we liked and keep it, but also lose a little bit of it because it would be hard to do. Do you want to expound on that, Clive? Like the transition from Faithful
Well,
Wookiee?
yeah, I mean, the spirit was still there. We kept the spirit of the short into the series. And yeah, in terms of the style of drawing, we had to cut it down a little bit. We had to simplify it a little bit. It was a lot of drawing. Mobius was very detailed, and it probably wouldn't have worked as well on a series if we had kept all that amount of detail in it, because things have to move quickly, you know. We just made sure that we kept the spirit of the Star Wars world and just had a great time in drawing and creating so many different characters throughout that series, so many different space vehicles. That was something that was a lot of fun. We had a whole design department just doing spaceships and coming up with the craziest designs, using objects laying around as inspiration for spaceships, not just normal sci-fi designs that you would expect, but things based on tubes of toothpaste or donuts or lampshades or something, and using those as starting points. And then, of course, there was a lot of side characters. So it was a lot of design, a lot of new design. It was production heavy, it was design heavy. The stories went through 3 or 4 episodes. So 4 episodes was a continuous story. Then the next 4 episodes was another story. Within those stories, coming up with all sorts of different characters and different devices, different designs. Michael will tell you that ABC was very, very strict on some of the weaponry that we had to use.
All the networks had standards and practice divisions or departments for Saturday morning because they would get upset letters, they'd be threatened with lawsuits. So they had to be concerned about what was safe for children, making sure that they didn't, help children into dangerous situations, right? Have them avoid it. So weapons was a big sensitive issue. And of course, this is Star Wars. This is not, Bambi. And basically, there's a lot of weapons in Star Wars, but they don't like the weapons to look like real weapons in that era. Our weapons, our guns had to look like vacuum cleaners or remote control changers. One of the things that I think took away from the show was that you couldn't have the weapons that looked like the weapons, right? They had to be more fantasy-like and not capable of imitative action, which was one of the key buzzwords for the standards and practice people. And the same thing applied to Ewoks, by the way, because they had spears, and so it was difficult to sort of execute that part of that show. One of the great things about the 2 shows was the theme songs. George had good relationships in the music business, and so he wanted us to work with Taj Mahal on Ewoks with that great theme of "We are the Ewoks, warriors of the Endor Moon or the Forest Moon." I can't remember. And with Stuart Copeland of the Police on Droids. So we had quite innovative soundtracks on both. In general, I think people really like the music.
I have to tell you, my husband and I, we love to just go to YouTube and listen to the Droids theme
Oh,
because
yeah.
it's so like this beautiful like 80s kind of like feel and like the electronic drums and all that stuff. So a lot of props on both of the songs, but like in particular, we really like the Droids theme
I
song.
would agree with you.
I really like the Ewoks theme song from Taj
Mhm.
because Taj had sort of missed all his deadlines, and we were a week away from delivering the final show. ABC did not like that theme song, but
What?
George insisted on it. And so the compromise was that we would sweeten it. And all we had was the rough version, the sort of demo. But Taj hadn't gone around to finishing it. And so I flew out with Mickey Herman, who was a Lucasfilm producer on the series. We had an appointment at Taj Mahal's recording studio in Hawaii. I think it was in Maui. And he didn't show. His engineer was there. We told him what we had to do, that we had to sweeten the sound and that we had to re-record his take. We had that day, and then the next day it had to be flown back to Toronto to,
So
you know,
Michael had to sing backup.
no,
And
I can't sing. It could have been Clive. You could have done it, but I couldn't do it. As a kid in school, they told me to move my lips, but don't open my mouth. I was not a singer. So we went to the local hotel where there were Hawaiian shape singers, right, who sung in those smooth tones. And we asked them if they'd come back to Taj's studio and we would hire them to do backup. They were laying in a track where it made it much sweeter. And Taj walked in and then he re-recorded his music. And then we got on a plane the next day and the music ended up in the show.
A lot of kismet, I think, in a lot of these things, right? Like it's so serendipitous that everything did end up coming together. But in the business, right, everything has to come together by some schedule, right? So you make it work.
There is no choice. We would have gone with the demo
Hmm.
inch, but certainly we would have gone with the demo sweetened with the shape singers. But we were fortunate enough to have Taj redo his track.
Nice.
Yeah. And one of the things about Droids that was kind of interesting was George wanted to do these four-parters that Clive was referring to. But again, standards and practice wouldn't accept cliffhanger endings or stories are to be continued. You couldn't say to be continued. So each episode had to have a natural ending. And then later you would edit them to be 1 2 hour story because that's what Lucasfilm wanted to do was release them on video as little movies. And for Droids, George did not give us Han Solo or Luke or Leia or
right,
Darth Vader. He gave
right.
us C-3PO and R2-D2, who are the Laurel and Hardy of the Star Wars universe. And that's great, but they're not leading people. So we had to invent characters that were kind of
Lead
like,
characters. Yeah.
yeah. And so because we were doing, I think, 4 different stories in the first series of Droids, we ended up having to create 4 sets of heroes and villains that continued for the four-parter, but then disappeared. It was the kind of show that would have worked better on cable. What's interesting is when Clone Wars is done for Cartoon Network a few years later, they don't have standards and practices anymore. They can have to be continued, right? They can have cliffhangers. They can have guns that look like guns. So it's really, in a way, doing Star Wars for Saturday Morning Network was kind of like doing Star Wars with your hands tied behind your back, right? But nonetheless, kids watch the show and, people have told us how much they love it.
Yeah, of course, of course. Just really quick jumping back to the holiday special, so the Faithful Wookiee. Boba Fett has this really interesting colored armor that's different than what we see, in Empire Strikes Back, right? I'd love to know what was kind of the inspiration for that, very iconic blue and yellow, armor. It's really cool.
We didn't know who the character really was. We didn't know a lot about him. So, we tried several different approaches to the character and several different color schemes, which we do always anyway with any character that we're developing. We have a series of different design approaches, physical looks, and we take those physical looks and put different colors to them and try them against different backgrounds. So it's a whole process. So I'm not remembering back very, very clearly 50 years ago, but whatever we came up with was something that we all agreed on. And George obviously liked it. But I know it's changed a lot. His like very subdued colors that he ended up with were very different from what we did. And I know that the reason for that was because he had to sort of fit between sort of Darth Vader, who is dark, and and some of the other fighter characters, and he had to kind of sit in between. And I know there's a whole color theory about that I was reading at some point, but yeah, things go through changes. Things go through, different levels of thought and development. It's all a work in progress. What can I say? Everything is a work in progress.
Exactly. I mean, it's so iconic though. Like I said, I've seen people at conventions who have made that specific variant of the Boba
Sure.
Fett
Okay.
armor.
Right.
It's very similar almost to the first Kenner Boba Fett, because it is that kind of grayish blue. And
Mm.
I mean,
I see you're fully geared up.
yes, I am. I mean,
So
they made,
you're the one who bought all the droids.
yes. I did. But what's it like being able to see stuff like this? In modern times, they're making these action figures that take the work that you guys created. What's that like?
It's rewarding because in the end, it's merchandise that pays for animation. It's very hard for animated projects to pay for themselves through, subscription and advertising. But, the real reason that people are in the business is to sort of sell merchandise at the end of the day. And that pays the bills. That allows you to go on and make more episodes. And
But it's also nice to see that one's own ideas are somehow being broadcast physically in
yeah,
toys, around the world. So it's good. It's good to see that. It's
yeah. And
very
kids
rewarding.
and, the fans for these cartoons really like to have the whole 360-degree experience, not only of watching the cartoon, but playing with the characters.
Sure.
So, which is obviously the case because Star Wars is one of the most popular toy lines ever. And people are still playing with it almost 50 years later.
Yeah, I'm one of them. So
Obviously.
That's great.
yeah, yeah. I mean, very similarly to that, kind of on the same vein, what's it like when you're watching? I mean, I don't know how much you're into watching new Star Wars shows or anything like that, but, you know, have you seen some of those references to your work that makes it into live action or makes it into some of the newer cartoons? What's that like for you?
I haven't gone looking for those things. I did watch The Mandalorian because it was so well made,
Mandalorian was really good, yeah.
and also, it was kind of, oh, Boba Fett gets his own show,
When I
So
when, yeah, sorry, when I look at those shows, I just wish we'd had the technology when we were doing what we were doing with pencils and paper, basically is what we did. We crafted in the traditional animation style.
there weren't even a lot of computerized animation stands at the time. Like
That's
computers
right.
were coming into animation, around that time. But they started with computerizing the moves on an animation stand. That was the beginning of it.
Yeah. What we had to do was to do everything was mathematical. We had to actually work out moves mathematically with a calculator and decide that something had to go from A to B, and it was 17 inches on the stand, right? And it had to be divided into so many frames. And we had to figure out what that was per frame with a slowdown at each end, you know, and all that was just calculated on it. And it was a list so that the camera operator would then just look at numbers on a counter. There were counters for the east west and counters for the north south, and then there was the zoom. The camera would zoom up and down. A very complicated piece of equipment. And yeah, before they were automated, it was a lot of work. And just imagine spending a day and a half on a complex shot, comes back from the lab and everything's perfect except for, and then you have to go back and do the whole thing again.
What's exciting is that the same, George was going through the same thing. So the movie that really inspired our whole experience was Star Wars, the first Star Wars movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
All those effects were being done in very, very, analog ways, right?
Yeah.
George set up his own special effects group to do it. And when I first flew out to meet with him, I was told to close my eyes as I walked through a room where they were doing a shot for The Empire Strikes Back because they didn't want anybody. It was all top secret, right? So I closed my eyes and walked by, but
No, you didn't. No, you didn't,
I
Michael.
did take a peek and I saw how they were doing it. And I thought, oh, great. It's interesting. We had the same problem in our cartoon that George had in doing his special effects, right?
But
So, but boy, has it come a long way.
sure. But you know what? The fun of doing this is inventing ways to do things. Just pulling a piece of software on the shelf and go, oh, yeah, 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 I know how this is done. Hair. You don't have to animate hair these days. There's a program for that. There's a program for everything. But back in the day, we had to figure out how to do everything. A shot, for instance, where it's a POV and you're going towards a cliff, and then you go over the cliff and dive right down into a landscape. You're not going to do that all on a 12 by 8-inch frame. So you have to work out ways of starting on that frame, but then transitioning into a huge piece of artwork that's like 4 feet by 3 feet. Working out just devices that allow you to do that. That sort of level of inventiveness is really what made our studio an exciting place. And everybody put something into that. There were people who were specialized in certain areas of visual effects or backlighting effects or color effects. And yeah, we just like made it up as we went along, essentially.
I recently did my memoirs called Animation Nation, and it tells the story of how we built Nelvana and how we got into the Star Wars project and all those things in kind of a lot of detail. And then it goes on and talks about, my career after we sold Nelvana and the other shows we did. And Clive has recently done his first comic book, or is it a graphic
Yes.
novel? I don't know. Which is it, Clive?
It's a graphic novel. I'll show you. Don't go away. Here it is.
Very cool. Yeah.
It's the rather unusual adventures of Ice Cream Girl and Mr. Licorice.
Love that.
It's sort of autobiographical. That's what it looks like inside.
That's
Anyway,
awesome.
it's about a young man who has a very, very serious condition
Sure.
that causes him to see the world as a cartoon. So
Mm.
from his point of view, it's very serious. From everybody else, it's rather funny. But anyway, he learns at some point that his father, in fact, was an animated character. So he has a cartoon gene. That is what's causing the vision. That's my story.
And
That's
a
my.
good story it is.
I think so too.
Um,
It was.
yeah.
It started. It was a film idea. It is still a film idea.
Right. Right.
Animation, live action combination.
And
Very
Chelsey,
cool.
were you fans of other Nelvana shows?
I honestly am not really sure. I should have done more research. I apologize.
Everything from
I
the
should
Care
tell
Bears,
you.
everything from the Care Bears to Beetlejuice to
Oh,
Roly
my
poly.
gosh. I'm so sorry that I didn't know that, but like, I mean, Care Bears. Like
yeah,
that's my childhood.
Franklin and Little Bear and Babar and Tintin.
Beetlejuice.
Oh,
Tintin.
that is literally like all the childhood shows I watched. Oh my gosh.
Inspector
That's so
Gadget.
cool. Inspector Gadget loved that.
Yeah.
Loved Inspector Gadget. That's so cool. I mean, it must be really awesome to have this big legacy of these shows that have really, I mean, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that they changed the lives of so many kids and,
Mm.
made
I'm
them think about the world in a different way.
sure. Yeah, it's really quite a good feeling. Often people come up to me and say, "Listen, I grew up on your shows. I
Mhm.
was 10 years old when I watched such and such."
But it
Um,
makes us feel really young.
Right.
It does. It does. It sort of keeps you young, doesn't it? In a way. In a
Well,
way.
listen, it's one of the great things is these shows really did impact a lot of people and were a lot of people's favorites. So, Magic School Bus was another one we did.
Oh my gosh. I'm like, I'm in the presence of greatness. I mean, I already knew that, but you know what I mean? Like, yeah, all classic shows that any 80s or 90s kid would absolutely recognize.
And
Specifically, the ant episode of the Magic School Bus is one of my favorite things ever. So,
Which
love
episode?
the ants when they shrink down and they see how the ant farm
oh,
works.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Kind of like wrapping up, I'd love if you could, kind of talk about your celebration panel and what are you most excited about going to celebration for?
So we're going
Well,
to show clips from the Faithful Wookiee, Droids, and Ewoks. And we'll get a chance to have a conversation together about what it was like making the shows and, sharing some of the stories we've shared today. And then the stories we held back so they could be there for the people who show up in person, which is an ad for show up in person.
I was
And
able to dig through a whole bunch of artwork that I've accumulated over the years. So we've come up with a good visual sort of presentation. So I think it'll be quite interesting. Anyway, I don't know. It's exciting.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to it. I have no idea what to expect.
Hmm.
I mean, we've been to fan expos and we've done a whole bunch of, and I know Michael has too, but I've been talking about my book in at different places and Michael's been doing his rounds. So we've got a sense of what these events are like. I've never been to the Star Wars celebration before. I know that they have had, I don't know if they're every year, but
yeah, they
yeah,
are every
yeah,
different country.
looking forward to it and think it's going to be amazing.
Yeah, so anybody watching or listening to this presentation, come and visit us in Tokyo if you're there.
Absolutely. I will definitely, I mean, I'm going to celebration as well.
Oh, you're going too.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
good.
I appreciate you meeting with me a few weeks in advance just because I'll be going to Tokyo tomorrow morning.
Oh, wow.
So,
Okay.
it would have been a little, crazy to figure out the schedules, that kind of thing. But are
So,
you planning to do anything in Tokyo while you're there? Anything touristy, or are you just going
Sure.
for celebration?
So we're going to celebrate Tokyo.
Awesome.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Very cool.
We'll be there for a couple of weeks.
Oh man, that's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's really awesome. Well, before we wrap up, is there anything else that you'd like to say or talk about?
Well, I'll share one last memory I have. And, Clive was referring to Ralph McQuarrie, who was the great designer behind Star Wars. And I was there for a meeting on droids. And George was working on his next movie, and maybe he was working on the next Raiders. He was, he always had a lot of projects going at once. And we were walking and we were talking about, either droids or Ewoks or both. And then Ralph McQuarrie was walking about 10 feet behind us, and he was drawing while he walked.
Mm.
George said, "Wait a minute." We all kept walking slowly, and he dropped back and looked at the design that McQuarrie was making, gave him some notes, because we turned around and saw that. And then McQuarrie just continued, sort of working on it. So that stood out in my mind as being somebody who didn't let one moment go to waste. He was frankly an incredibly efficient person who could do
And
multitasks like no one else.
so passionate and so dedicated. He was such a brilliant artist. Really, really beautiful work. The incident that I remember is I worked with Ben Burt on one of the specials we did for Droids, and it was called The Great Heap. It was a 1 hour piece, and I had gone down to present the storyboard to George, and it was the room. There was about 14 people, George obviously, but about 14 other people in the room. I had put the entire storyboard on little slides and I put them in carousels, I had about 5 carousels. So I'm swapping the carousels and projecting and talking And it was an hour special. So it took me, I guess it must have taken me about an hour and a half just to go through the whole thing because I'm explaining every shot, talking about. The room is absolutely quiet. There's not a murmur. There's not a murmur. I'm trying to say a few things funny, a couple of funny things that there might have been a little bit of a snicker, but no snickering, nothing at all. George is sitting in the front, just not saying. So, oh God, I'm thinking, what is this going okay? Is everybody hating this? Like, why nobody's even breathing in this room? And at one point, I asked for a glass of water, which was a good break for me. So anyway, I got to the end of it and George clapped. And then everybody else claps. So everybody's waiting for George, right? Nobody's going to dare any expression without George. Anyway,
Good to
it
be the
was a
king.
huge relief. It was a huge relief.
Oh, I am sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Did you have anything you wanted to add, Michael?
No, no, I just said it's good to be king, you know.
Oh, yes, of course. Who wouldn't want to be George
Absolutely.
Lucas? Oh, well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me and share your stories with Boba Fett Fan Club. Thank you so much. It really has been a pleasure talking with you both.
Certainly
Thank you
great.
so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye.
Thanks.
See you in
Bye-bye.
Tokyo.